The year is 1896. In the forgotten folds of the Arkansas Ozarks, where the limestone bluffs weep with moisture and the trees grow so thick they strangle the sun, a mapmaker named Elias Thorne went looking for a line on a piece of paper. He was a man of science and reason, an agent of progress sent from Boston to chart the untamed wilderness for the coming railroad. What he found instead was a place where progress had died, and something else, something ancient and unholy, had taken root. His compass would lead him astray. His charts would prove useless. For the land he was about to enter was not on any map, and the people who inhabited it were not in any census. They were a festering secret, a wound in the heart of the country, a family whose very existence was a forbidden whisper. Elia's first sign of the encroaching horror was not a sound, nor a shadow. It was an object lying half submerged in the cloying mud of a creek bed. A small, crudely stitched doll made from burlap and stuffed with what felt like dried leaves. But the doll was wrong. Its proportions were twisted, its limbs unnaturally long, and sewn into its face were not two but three mismatched button eyes. It was a child's toy made in the image of a nightmare. Elias, a man accustomed to the clean logic of longitude and latitude, felt a primal chill crawl up his spine. He pocketed the grotesque effigy, an unknowing collector of accursed artifact. He believed it to be a strange backwoods curio. He could not have known he was holding a key to a horrifying story that history itself had tried to bury, a story of a family so disturbing, their name was systematically erased from every record, every book, and every map. A family erased from time. Elias pressed onward, the disquiet from the doll a low hum beneath his thoughts. His task was to survey the unforgiving terrain of what was known as Hemlock Hollow. The name itself was a warning, an omen whispered by the grim-faced locals in the nearest town of Providence, a dusty outpost clinging to the edge of civilization. They spoke of the hollow in hushed tones, their words laced with a mixture of pity and revulsion. They called the inhabitants the Hollow Folk, or the Silent Ones. They were a ghost story told to frighten children, a cautionary tale about the darkness that festers in isolation. The people of Providence were clear. No one went into Hemlock Hollow. The mail didn't run there, the preacher didn't visit, and the law turned a blind eye. It was a self-imposed quarantine, a pocket of the 19th century that had been left to rot. Elias, ever the rationalist, dismissed their warnings as simple superstition, the uneducated fears of a people wary of the unknown. He was a man of the modern age, a believer in empirical data and observable fact. But as he ventured deeper, the forest itself seemed to change. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The birds fell silent. The sunlight, once dappled and warm, became a pale, sickly green, filtered through a suffocating canopy of hemlock and kudzu. He began to see things that defied easy explanation. Strange symbols, neither tribal nor colonial, were carved into the bark of ancient trees, spiraling patterns that seemed to draw the eye inward, creating a dizzying, hypnotic effect. They were territorial markers, a forbidden alphabet for a people who had no written language. They were a warning he was already too late to heed. The further Elias traveled, the more the land felt like a conscious entity, actively resisting his presence. The trails on his map dissolved into impenetrable thickets of thorn and vine. The gentle slopes became treacherous, scree-covered inclines. It was as if the hollow was protecting its secret, using the very landscape as a barrier. After 2 days of grueling travel, he stumbled upon something that froze the blood in his veins. In a small, overgrown clearing, he found the rusted remnants of a surveyor's transit, identical to his own. Beside it lay a rotted leather satchel, torn open and spilling its contents onto the forest floor. Mold-caked papers, a shattered compass, and a single cracked daguerreotype photograph of a woman and child. He recognized the equipment as belonging to the previous surveyor, a man named Abernathy, who had been dispatched to this same region 3 years prior and had simply vanished. The official report concluded he had been the victim of a bear attack, a common and convenient explanation for men lost to the wilderness. But there were no bones here, no signs of a struggle with an animal. There was only the quiet, deliberate decay of a man, abandoned life. It was here that Elias first felt true, unadulterated fear. This was not the work of a bear. This was a place where people were unmade, where they were swallowed whole, leaving behind only the faintest echoes of their existence. The hollow was not just uninhabited, it was a predator. Abernathy had come seeking the same lines on a map as Elias. He had ignored the same warnings, and now all that was left of him was this pathetic, moss-covered gravesite. Elias felt a growing certainty that the strange symbols on the trees were not just warnings. They were signposts on a path to a similar, horrifying fate. Driven by a morbid curiosity that now outweighed his professional duty, Elias followed the trail of eerie symbols deeper into the hollow. The carvings became more frequent, more elaborate, as if he were approaching a nexus of whatever dark power resided here. The forest eventually gave way to a large, unnatural clearing. In the center stood a small collection of dilapidated cabins, clustered together like rotting teeth. They were crudely built from rough-hewn logs and mud, with sagging roofs and dark, vacant windows that stared out like hollow eye sockets. There was no smoke from the chimneys, no sound of life or livestock. The entire settlement was cloaked in a profound and unsettling silence. This, he knew, was the home of the hollow folk. This was the source of the whispers and the fear. From a concealed position on a ridge overlooking the compound, Elias watched. For hours he saw nothing. Then, as dusk began to bleed through the trees, figures emerged from the cabins. They moved with a strange, shambling gait, their bodies contorted in ways that seemed to defy the natural construction of a human skeleton. Their limbs were too long, their backs too stooped. They communicated not with words but with a series of soft clicks and low guttural hums, a disturbing and primitive form of speech that made the hairs on Elias' arms stand on end. He could see their faces, pale, with wide-set, vacant eyes and slack jaws. There was a sameness to them, a disturbing family resemblance that was both absolute and profoundly wrong. This was not just a family. It was a species of one, a closed loop of humanity that had turned inward and begun to curdle. The sight was so macabre, so fundamentally disturbing, that Elias had to stifle a gasp. The folk tales were real, and the reality was infinitely more horrifying than any story. For 2 days, Elias remained hidden, a silent observer of the macabre tableau below. He was a scientist cataloging a forbidden species. The family, which he estimated to be no more than a dozen individuals, followed a strange and ritualistic routine. They moved with a dreamlike slowness, performing chores with a listless, vacant energy. There were no children playing, no sounds of laughter or joy. There was only the oppressive silence, punctuated by their unnerving clicks and whispers. He noted the profound physical deformities that afflicted nearly every one of them. One man had a right arm that was withered and useless, while his left was unnaturally long and powerful. A young woman walked with a severe limp, her spine twisted into a painful-looking curve. Their faces, all sharing the same pale, wide-eyed look, were masks of genetic decay. It was inbreeding, of course. Generations of it, concentrated and unfiltered in this isolated valley. A genetic cul-de-sac. But this was something more than the simple recessive traits he'd read about in medical journals. This was a devolution, a retreat from the human form. What horrified Elias most was their apparent lack of self-awareness. They seemed to feel no shame, no suffering. They simply existed, a placid and grotesque monument to a biological dead end. They were the Blackwood family, though Elias would not learn their name until later. A name that was once spoken with pride, but was now a cursed word, a name that the outside world had tried to forget. He was witnessing a truth so disturbing that the community of Providence had chosen to build a wall of silence and superstition around it. Hopping the horror would simply consume itself. If you find these dives into forgotten and forbidden history compelling, consider subscribing to our channel. The records of the Blackwood family were sealed and burned, but the story survived, and it only gets more disturbing from here. On the 3rd day of his surveillance, a storm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised purple, and a cold, driving rain began to fall, turning the hollow into a slick quagmire of mud. Trapped on the ridge, Elias sought shelter in a small, shallow cave he'd found, a damp crevice in the rock face. As he huddled in the darkness, listening to the storm rage outside, his hand brushed against something buried in the loose soil at the back of the cave. It was a leather-bound book, swollen and stiff with dampness, its pages warped and stained. An oilskin wrap had partially protected it from the worst of the decay. With trembling hands, Elias managed to pry it open. It was a journal. The elegant, looping cursive identified its author as a Dr. Alastair Finch, dated 1872, a traveling physician. As Elias carefully turned the brittle pages, a horrifying story began to unfold, a story that provided a clinical, first-hand account of the genesis of the Blackwood curse. Dr. Finch had been called to the Hollow nearly a quarter of a century earlier to attend to a difficult birth. He wrote of his journey, describing the same oppressive atmosphere, the same strange symbols on the trees. He had been led to the cabins by the family's patriarch, a man named Jedediah Blackwood. Jedediah was a grim, imposing man, but it was his wife, Elspeth, who truly unsettled the doctor. She was also his sister. Finch's entry for that day was filled with a mix of medical shock and moral revulsion. He described Jedediah's fanatical, pseudo-religious belief that his family line was special, chosen, and that it must be kept pure and untainted by the blood of outsiders. Their union was not a sin in Jedediah's eyes, but a sacred duty. The child being born that night was the product of this unholy pact, a new branch on a poisoned family tree. Dr. Finch's journal became a chronicle of horrors. He described the child born that night, a boy they named Cain. The baby was born with a cleft palate and a visible curvature of the spine. Finch tried to explain the dangers of their consanguineous union to Jedediah, using the scientific terms of the day. He spoke of blood malady and hereditary weakness. But his words were met with a cold, unyielding fanaticism. Jedediah Blackwood saw the child's deformities not as a genetic aberration, but as a trial, a mark of their family's unique spiritual journey. He believed the outside world was corrupt, and that only by sealing themselves off, by turning inward and mingling their blood, could they preserve their sacred lineage. The doctor's subsequent entries, written over a period of several visits he felt compelled to make out of a morbid sense of duty, painted an even darker picture. He documented the birth of 2 more children to Jedediah and Elspeth, each one bearing more pronounced afflictions than the last. A daughter with fused fingers, a son with eyes that would not track together. Finch wrote of Elspeth's deteriorating mental state, her descent into a silent, vacant apathy. He described the other families who had originally settled the Hollow with the Blackwoods, families who had either died out or fled from Jedediah's increasingly tyrannical and bizarre ideology. By the mid-1870s, only the Blackwoods remained. They had achieved their goal. They were pure. They were isolated, and they were beginning to rot from the inside out. Elias Thorne sat in the damp cave, the storm raging outside, and realized he was reading the origin story of the shambling, broken people he had been watching. They were not just a family. They were a cult, built on a foundation of incest and religious delusion. The most disturbing passage in Dr. Finch's journal was his final entry. It was dated 1875, 3 years after his first visit. His handwriting was frantic, barely legible, the ink smudged as if written in great haste. He wrote that he had returned to the Hollow one last time, uninvited, compelled by a feeling of dread he couldn't shake. He found the compound had changed. The atmosphere of grim piety had been replaced by something feral, something truly pagan. The strange, spiraling symbols Elias had seen on the trees were now painted on the cabin doors in what looked like dried blood. Jedediah was gone, having died from a fever the previous winter. In his absence, Elspeth and her eldest, most severely deformed son, Cain, now presided over the family. The doctor described a horrifying scene he witnessed from the woods. The family was gathered in the clearing, chanting in a monotonous, non-verbal hum, the same clicks and guttural sounds Elias had heard. They were swaying before a crude effigy, a towering figure made of sticks and animal pelts, adorned with the skulls of small animals. It was a macabre scarecrow god. They were no longer Christians if they ever truly were. They had created their own religion, a faith born of isolation, madness, and genetic decay. Finch wrote that he saw the younger children, now adolescents, moving with the same unnatural gait Elias had observed. The English language was gone, replaced entirely by their primitive form of communication. They had become something other than human. The doctor's final, chilling words were scrawled at the bottom of the page. "I have looked into the face of a dying branch of humanity. They are not merely sick, they are unmaking themselves. God forgive them, for they are truly lost. I will not return. I will tell the authorities to seal this place, to forget it exists. It is a contagion of the soul." The storm finally broke. A watery gray dawn seeped into the hollow, and Elias emerged from the cave, his mind reeling from the contents of the journal. The book was a Rosetta Stone for the horror he had witnessed. It explained the vacant eyes, the twisted limbs, the silent, clicking language. He was not just looking at a family. He was looking at the end result of Jedediah Blackwood's mad dream. The family was a living relic of a forbidden history. Armed with this new, terrifying knowledge, Elias looked down at the Blackwood compound with a new perspective. He saw not just deformity but devolution. He saw not just isolation but the creation of an entirely new and broken culture. He knew he had to leave, to take the journal and his story back to Providence, back to the civilized world. This was a matter for the authorities, for doctors, for the church. This was a profound human tragedy that could not be allowed to fester in the shadows any longer. But as he prepared to retreat, a new, horrifying thought took root in his mind. The surveyor Abernathy. What had truly happened to him? The Blackwoods were territorial. They were feral. Dr. Finch had described a descent into paganism and blood ritual. Had Abernathy stumbled upon them as Elias had? Had he been seen as an intruder, a contamination from the outside world that Jedediah had so feared? The image of the rusted transit and the rotted satchel took on a more sinister meaning. It was not an abandoned camp. It was a trophy, a warning left for the next person to trespass. Elias realized with a jolt of ice-cold dread that the Blackwoods knew he was there. His presence over the past 3 days could not have gone unnoticed by a people so attuned to their environment. The silence, the slow, dreamlike movements, perhaps it was not vacancy. Perhaps it was patience. Perhaps they were waiting for him. Panic set in, cold and sharp. The hollow, which had been a subject of morbid fascination, now felt like a perfectly designed trap. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sounded like an approaching footstep. Elias scrambled to gather his things, his movements clumsy with fear. He had to get out. He knew the way back, but the journey now seemed impossibly long and fraught with peril. He cast one last look down at the compound. The figures were emerging again, beginning their slow, silent morning rituals. But one of them stopped. A tall, gaunt figure with unnaturally long arms. It stood perfectly still in the center of the clearing and slowly, deliberately lifted its head, its pale, wide-set eyes staring directly at the ridge where Elias was hiding. There was no mistaking it. He had been seen. The figure did not shout or run. It simply stood there, its gaze an unnerving mixture of vacancy and ancient, predatory intelligence. Then it let out a sound, not a click, not a hum, but a high-pitched, warbling cry that echoed through the silent hollow. It was a sound that did not belong in a human throat, an alarm, a call to the hunt. Immediately the other figures stopped what they were doing and turned, their heads snapping in his direction with an unnatural, synchronized quickness. The hunt had begun. Elias didn't wait. He turned and ran, crashing blindly through the undergrowth, the doctor's journal clutched in his hand like a holy relic. The forest that had been his hiding place was now his enemy, its roots and thorns tearing at his clothes and skin. Behind him he could hear them coming. There was no sound of crashing footsteps, only an eerie, rhythmic rustling, the sound of multiple bodies moving through the forest with a silent, practiced ease. They were home here. He was the intruder, and they were closing in. Elias ran with a desperation he had never known, his lungs burning, his heart hammering against his ribs. The disciplined mind of the cartographer was gone, replaced by the primal terror of a cornered animal. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel their presence, a relentless closing perimeter of silence. He could hear that high-pitched, warbling call passed from one to another as they fanned out, their movements coordinated and terrifyingly efficient. This was not a mindless chase. It was a strategic envelopment. They were hurting him. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw a flash of pale skin, a contorted shape moving with impossible speed through the dense woods. They moved with a loping, simian grace, their long arms helping them navigate the treacherous terrain. They were not running, they were flowing through the forest, a part of it. He realized his mistake. He was running back the way he came, along the creek bed where he had found the doll. It was the only path he knew, and they knew it too. He was being funneled into a kill zone. Panic gave way to a sliver of cold calculation. He had to break the pattern. Veering sharply to his right, he scrambled up a steep, muddy embankment, clawing at roots and rocks for purchase. He was heading deeper into the uncharted parts of the hollow, away from the familiar path, hoping to lose them in the chaos of the wilderness. He could hear them below, their clicking sounds growing more agitated, confused by his sudden change of direction. He had bought himself a few precious moments. At the top of the embankment, he found himself in a part of the forest that was older, darker. The trees were ancient, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes, and the ground was covered in a thick carpet of moss that muffled his footsteps. It was here, in this primeval gloom, that he found the cave. It wasn't the same small crevice where he'd found the journal. This was a true cave, a dark maw in the side of a limestone bluff, partially concealed by a curtain of hanging vines. It smelled of damp earth and something else, something cloying and metallic, the smell of old blood. With the sounds of the pursuit growing closer again, Elias had no choice. He pushed through the vines and plunged into the darkness, praying it was deep enough to hide him. The cave was larger than it appeared from the outside. The air was cold, still, and unnaturally quiet. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he could make out the faint outlines of shapes within. They were arranged along the walls, standing in silent rows. They looked like more of the stick-and pelt effigies Dr. Finch had described, like the one he'd seen in the clearing. But as he drew closer, the horrifying truth dawned on him. These were not effigies. They were bodies. The Blackwood dead were not buried. They were preserved. Dressed in decaying homespun clothes, they were propped up against the cave walls, their bodies leathery and desiccated by the cold, dry air. Their faces were hollowed-out masks, their empty eye sockets staring into the eternal darkness. In the center of the cave stood the largest figure, seated on a crude throne of stone. It was Jedediah Blackwood, the patriarch, his body arranged in a position of honor, a crown of yellowed animal teeth on his skull. Elias had stumbled into the Blackwood family's forbidden mausoleum. This was their church. This was their graveyard. It was a macabre temple dedicated to the purity of their line, where the dead watched over the living. The metallic smell was the smell of generations of decay, a concentrated miasma of their horrifying legacy. He was standing in the very heart of their madness. Elias recoiled in horror, stumbling backward, his hand clamping over his mouth to stifle a scream. The cave was a gallery of grotesques. He could see the progression of their genetic decay etched into the preserved bodies of their ancestors. The older ones near the back looked relatively normal, but as he scanned the rows, the deformities became more and more pronounced. Twisted spines, elongated skulls, withered limbs, a physical record of their slow, agonizing descent into biological ruin. This was more than a tomb. It was a testament to their fanatical beliefs. By keeping their dead with them, they were reinforcing the continuity of their pure bloodline, a constant, visible reminder of their sacred covenant. They were surrounded by their history, their failures preserved for all time. Suddenly, a sound from the cave entrance. The silhouette of a figure appeared, blocking the faint light. It was the tall, gaunt one, the one who had raised the alarm. It stood there for a moment, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, its wide eyes scanning the darkness. Elias pressed himself into a recess behind the seated corpse of Jedediah, his breath catching in his throat. He was trapped. The creature took a hesitant step into the cave, its bare feet making no sound on the dusty floor. It let out a soft, inquisitive click. It knew he was here. It could smell him. The scent of the living, the outsider, the taint. It began to move slowly along the wall, its long, spindly fingers gently brushing against the leathery skin of its dead ancestors, as if asking them for guidance. It was a scene of such profound and disturbing intimacy that Elias felt his sanity begin to fray. This was not a monster from a storybook. It was something far worse, a human being unmade. The creature moved deeper into the cave, its patient, silent search a form of psychological torture. Elias remained frozen, his mind screaming. He was surrounded by the dead and hunted by the living. He knew that if he was found, his fate would be unspeakable. He wouldn't just be killed. He would be incorporated into their horrifying world. Perhaps he would become a trophy like Abernathy. Or perhaps, in a final, macabre act of preservation, his body would be added to their silent, watchful collection. As the Blackwood creature passed the stone throne, its gaze fell upon the floor. There, in the fine layer of dust, was a fresh scuff mark, the mark from Elias' boot when he had stumbled back in horror. The creature stopped. Its head slowly turned, its vacant eyes locking onto the space behind the corpse of its ancestor. It let out another soft click, this time not of inquiry but of discovery. It knew. In that moment, Elias knew it was over. But as the creature took a step towards him, a new sound echoed from the mouth of the cave. It was a different call, a lower, more guttural command. The creature froze, its attention diverted. Another figure appeared at the entrance, this one shorter, wider, and leaning heavily on a crude wooden crutch. Even in the dim light, Elias could see the authority it commanded. The other Blackwoods, who had been gathering outside, fell silent. This was a leader, the matriarch perhaps. The figure at the entrance issued a series of sharp, commanding clicks. The tall, gaunt creature looked from the matriarch to the hiding spot, a flicker of what looked like conflict in its dead eyes. Then, with a final, low hum, it turned and slowly, reluctantly, shuffled out of the cave. The hunt was called off. Elias was spared, but he had no idea why. Elias remained hidden in the suffocating darkness for what felt like an eternity, listening. The Blackwoods were gone. The silence of the tomb returned, broken only by the frantic drumming of his own heart. Why had they let him go? Was it a trap? An act of mercy from a people he thought were beyond such concepts? He couldn't comprehend it. It was a logic that belonged to them, not to him. Shaking and disoriented, he finally crept out from behind the corpse of Jedediah. He had to get out of the cave, out of the hollow. He staggered towards the entrance, emerging into the gray afternoon light, blinking like a man reborn. The forest was silent again. The hunt was over. As he stumbled away from the cave of the dead, he realized the profoundness of what he had uncovered. This wasn't just a story of an inbred family. It was the story of a failed civilization, a micro-society that had deliberately severed itself from the human race and paid a horrifying price. The world of progress, of railroads and maps, seemed a million miles away. What Elias found next would provide the final, heartbreaking piece of the puzzle. Not far from the cave, nestled in a small, sheltered alcove, he found what looked like a nursery. But it was a nursery of the dead. Arranged in a semicircle were a dozen small, cloth-wrapped bundles. The infants. The ones born too deformed, too broken to survive even in their debased society. The stillborn, the miscarried, the ones who died in their first few days. They were not preserved like the adults. They were laid to rest here in this quiet, sad little corner of the hollow. Beside them were offerings, smooth stones, bird feathers, and dozens of crude, twisted dolls. Dolls with too many limbs and mismatched button eyes. The doll he had found in the creek had not been a toy. It was a grave marker, a tribute to a lost child. The sight of the infant's graveyard broke something in Elias. The terror he had felt was replaced by a profound, soul-crushing sadness. These creatures, these hollow folk, were not just monsters. They were a people locked in a cycle of suffering, trapped by the fanatical beliefs of an ancestor long dead. Their pagan rituals, their mausoleum of the dead, their silent, clicking language. It was all a desperate attempt to make sense of a world that had dealt them an impossible hand. They were victims. Victims of a mad idea. This revelation fueled his resolve. The story of the Blackwoods needed to be told, not as a macabre tale to frighten children, but as a tragic lesson. Dr. Finch had been right to want to seal this place off, but he was wrong to think it should be forgotten. Forgetting was what had allowed this horror to fester for another 25 years. Elias finally found his way back to the main trail, his body aching, his mind scarred. He walked through the night, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need to escape the suffocating gloom of Hemlock Hollow. He did not stop until he saw the first flickering lights of Providence on the horizon. He stumbled into the town at dawn, a wild, haggard figure, his clothes torn, his face scratched and pale. He went directly to the only authority in town, the sheriff. He burst into the small, dusty office, the doctor's journal clutched in his hand, and began to speak, the words pouring out of him in a frantic, disjointed torrent. He spoke of the cabins, the symbols, the silent people, the cave of the dead, and the graveyard of the infants. He presented the journal as proof. The story of the Blackwood family was finally dragged out of the shadows and into the light. Sheriff Brody was an old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes weary from a lifetime of dealing with the quiet desperation of a backwoods town. He listened to Elia's story with a heavy, stoic patience, his expression unreadable. He took the doctor's journal and slowly, methodically, turned its water-stained pages, his lips moving silently as he read passages from a history he already seemed to know. When Elias was finished, the sheriff leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. He was silent for a long time. "Son," he said finally, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "some things are better left buried." He went on to explain that he knew of the Hollow folk. His own father had been the sheriff when Dr. Finch first came back from the Hollow, raving about what he had seen. The town elders had made a decision back then, a pact of silence. They would treat Hemlock Hollow as a non-place. They would discourage travel, invent ghost stories, and allow nature to solve the problem. They were afraid of the scandal, afraid of the shame, and on some deep primal level, afraid that the Blackwood madness was a contagion that could spread. "We ain't proud of it," the sheriff admitted, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the dirty window. "But we figured it was the most merciful thing to do. Let 'em be. Let God sort 'em out." But Elias' story and the tale of the vanished surveyor Abernathy had changed things. The Blackwoods were no longer a passive, isolated tragedy. They were a potential threat. A line had been crossed. The outside world had been touched, and now it had to respond. The sheriff sighed, a sound of profound resignation. He stood up, strapped on his gun belt, and told Elias to wait. He was going to gather a posse. The time for silence was over. The posse that Sheriff Brody assembled was not a band of eager vigilantes. They were grim, tight-lipped men, farmers, a blacksmith, the town doctor, all of them descendants of the families who had made the pact of silence generations ago. The story of the Blackwoods was their secret shame, a local curse they had all inherited. They gathered in the street outside the sheriff's office, their shotguns held loosely in their hands, their eyes avoiding Elias. He was the outsider who had forced their hand, who had made them confront the darkness they had tried so hard to ignore. The sheriff gave his instructions. This was not a rescue, and it was not a massacre. It was an investigation, an abatement of a public nuisance, as he gruffly called it. They were to go to the Hollow, assess the situation, and bring the Blackwoods out. What would happen then, no one knew. There was no protocol for discovering a lost tribe of devolved human beings. As they rode out of town, a heavy silence hung over the group. The men knew the legends, the ghost stories. But now, thanks to Elias, the ghost had a face, a pale, deformed face with vacant, watching eyes. The journey to the Hollow was tense. The men grew quieter, more watchful as they entered the oppressive woods. The forest seemed to sense their purpose, the air growing thick with an unspoken menace. When they found the first of the strange, spiraling symbols carved into a tree, a palpable wave of fear rippled through the posse. The stories were true. The forbidden place was real. Elias rode with the sheriff at the front, guiding them, the doctor's journal now in the sheriff's saddlebag. He felt a strange mixture of vindication and dread. He had wanted the world to know, but now that the world was responding, he feared what it would do. When the posse reached the ridge overlooking the Blackwood compound, they were met with a scene of utter devastation. The cabins were gone. In their place were the smoldering, blackened skeletons of the structures, tendrils of greasy smoke still curling into the gray, overcast sky. The entire settlement had been burned to the ground. The fire had been intense, all-consuming. There were no bodies, no survivors, no sign of the dozen or so individuals Elias had seen just the day before. The oppressive silence that had once cloaked the living now cloaked the dead, a silence of ash and ruin. Sheriff Brody and his men cautiously descended into the clearing, their boots crunching on charred wood and debris. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt pine and something else, something sickeningly sweet that turned the stomach. The men searched the ruins, their faces grim masks of disbelief and horror. The place had been wiped clean, sterilized by fire. Who had done this? Had the Blackwoods, in a final act of madness, destroyed themselves, or had some other force been at work? The sheriff found Elias and pointed towards a set of tracks leading away from the clearing and into the deep woods. They were shod horse tracks, a dozen or more, and they were fresh. Someone else had been here. Someone who had arrived after Elias left and before the posse arrived. A chilling realization began to dawn on Elias. The posse he was with was not the first. The matriarch's call at the cave. It hadn't been to call off the hunt for him. It had been to warn of a different, more dangerous intruder. The posse was on edge. The discovery of the tracks of another unknown group changed everything. This was no longer just about the Blackwoods. Sheriff Brody sent 2 of his men to follow the tracks, while he and the others continued their grim investigation of the ruins. Elias, his mind racing, led the sheriff to the location of the burial cave. He had to show him the proof, the undeniable, macabre evidence of the Blackwood lineage. When they reached the limestone bluff, they found the entrance to the cave had been sealed. A massive rock slide composed of freshly broken stone and upturned earth blocked the dark maw completely. It was no natural collapse. The rocks were deliberately placed, the earth packed tight. Someone had intentionally entombed the Blackwood ancestors, burying their forbidden history under tons of rock. This was a systematic erasure. First the compound, now the tomb. Whoever had come here had been determined to wipe every last trace of the family from the face of the earth. The men from the posse looked at the sealed cave with a mixture of fear and, strangely, relief. The ghosts of Hemlock Hollow were now truly ghosts, sealed away in their dark, silent tomb. It was at this moment that the 2 scouts returned, their faces pale with shock. They had followed the horse tracks for a mile. They didn't lead towards Providence. They led deeper into the Ozarks, towards the wild, uncharted territory to the north, and they found something else. The tracks of the Blackwoods, the unshod, bare footprints were there too. They were fleeing. They weren't dead in the fire. They had been driven out, chased from their ancestral home by this unknown, violent force. The horrifying truth was that the Blackwoods were still out there, scattered and terrified, running for their lives in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The question hung in the air, unspoken but terrifying. Who were the other riders? Who had the motive and the means to descend on this forgotten hollow and expunge it with such brutal efficiency? Sheriff Brody, a man who understood the dark undercurrents of his county, had a suspicion. He gathered his men and made a decision. Their investigation was over. Officially, they would report that the settlement was found abandoned and had been destroyed in a forest fire. The Blackwood family, who never officially existed on any census, would be listed as unaccounted for. Abernathy, the surveyor, would remain a victim of a bear attack. The official story would be a neat, tidy lie, a final layer of earth shoveled onto a history that was too disturbing to confront. The posse did not argue. They were more than willing to accept the fiction. They wanted nothing more than to leave this cursed place and forget everything they had seen. As they rode back to Providence, Sheriff Brody pulled up alongside Elias. He handed him back the doctor's journal. "This book," the sheriff said, his voice low and firm, "never existed. The man who wrote it was a fantasist. The family it describes is a fiction." He locked eyes with Elias, his meaning perfectly clear. This was not a request, it was an order. "You are a cartographer. You came here, you surveyed your line, and you left. You saw nothing in Hemlock Hollow but trees and rocks. Do you understand?" Elias, numb with shock and exhaustion, could only nod. He understood that he was being conscripted into the same pact of silence that had shrouded this place for decades. He was now a keeper of the secret, a guardian of the lie. The truth, he was beginning to realize, was a far more dangerous and complicated thing than the clean, straight lines on his maps. Back in Providence, the official story settled over the town like a shroud, a forest fire, a tragic but natural event. The men of the posse kept their silence, their shared experience a dark bond between them. They would carry the images of the smoldering ruins and the sealed tomb to their graves. Elias Thorne finished his surveying work, his hands moving with mechanical precision, his mind 1,000 miles away in the dark woods of Hemlock Hollow. He was haunted. He would see the vacant, wide-set eyes of the Blackwoods in his sleep. He would hear their strange, clicking language on the wind. The horror of what he had seen was a splinter in his soul, a piece of the hollow that he would carry with him forever. Before he left Arkansas, he did something that went against the sheriff's direct order. He could not destroy Dr. Finch's journal. It was the only tangible proof, the only testament to the Blackwood family's tragic existence. He sealed it in an oilskin pouch and mailed it to a trusted colleague at the Historical Society in Boston, along with a long, detailed letter explaining everything he had witnessed. He urged his colleague to preserve it, to hide it away in the archives, a time capsule of a forbidden history. He wrote, "The world may not be ready for this story now, but it must not be lost forever. To forget the Blackwoods is to commit a second, greater crime against them." The story was now preserved, but it was also buried again, this time in a dusty archive hundreds of miles away. It became another forgotten file, another whisper in the vast, silent library of human history. The erasure of the Blackwood family was nearly complete, but whispers have a way of surviving. The fate of the surviving Blackwoods remains one of the most chilling and unresolved parts of this macabre story. Driven from their ancestral home, where did they go? The deep Ozark wilderness is a vast and labyrinthine place, a land of hidden caves, box canyons, and impenetrable forests. It is entirely possible that the scattered remnants of the family found a new hollow, an even more isolated and secluded place to hide from a world that had proven so hostile. For decades after the fire of 1896, strange stories would occasionally trickle out of the mountains. Hunters would report seeing strange, pale figures moving through the trees at dusk. Trappers would find their lines disturbed, the animals taken, and strange, spiraling symbols left carved in the nearby trees. There were even rumors of a wild clan that lived deep in the mountains, a people who did not speak and who shunned all contact with the outside world. Were these just campfire stories, the echoes of the Blackwood legend? Or were they fleeting glimpses of the survivors, a new generation born in the wild, even more feral and divorced from humanity than their parents? The truth is impossible to know. They left no records, no bodies, no trace. They simply vanished into the landscape, becoming one with the dark woods and the ghost stories told about them. The unknown posse had not exterminated them. They had merely displaced them, turning them from a sedentary horror into a nomadic one, a chilling enigma forever wandering the forgotten corners of the American wilderness. The thought of this lost, broken tribe, still out there, is perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the Blackwood curse. So who were the mysterious riders who burned the Blackwood compound and sealed their tomb? This is the final dark question at the heart of the cover-up. The evidence points to a chilling conclusion. The horse tracks were not from strangers. They were local. The efficiency of the erasure, the knowledge of where to find the compound and the tomb, the systematic way they destroyed the evidence, it all points to an inside job. It was likely a second, more ruthless posse, formed from the descendants of the original founding families of Providence. Men who, unlike Sheriff Brody, believed the only way to deal with the Blackwood stain was to cauterize the wound completely. Perhaps a hunting party had stumbled upon the compound, or perhaps Abernathy's disappearance had finally triggered a more extreme faction in the town to act. They were not lawmen. They were vigilantes, acting under the cover of their own self-imposed law. They saw the Blackwoods not as a human tragedy, but as a blight, an infection that threatened the moral and spiritual health of their community. Their actions were not of mercy, but of purification. They drove the family out like animals and burned their world to ash, hoping the fire would cleanse the land of their memory. Sheriff Brody's official cover-up was likely not just to protect the town's reputation, but to protect these men from the gallows. He knew who they were. He may have even tacitly approved of their methods. In the harsh, unforgiving world of the 19th century frontier, justice was often a brutal and expedient affair. The erasure of the Blackwood family was a community effort, a conspiracy of silence and violence that was ruthlessly and successfully executed. The story of the Blackwood family is a chilling example of how history is written by the victors, or in this case, by the survivors who hold the pen. The official records of that county in Arkansas for 1896 show nothing out of the ordinary. Births, deaths, land deeds. There is no mention of a fire in Hemlock Hollow. There is no report of a posse being formed. There is no record of the Blackwood name ever. It is a perfect, seamless fabrication. The historical record is silent because it was forced into silence. This is what makes cases like this so disturbing. It's not just the macabre details of the family itself, but the chilling realization of how easily a truth can be buried. How a community, through a collective act of will, can decide that something never happened. They created a shared delusion, a lie that was passed down through generations until the truth was relegated to the realm of folklore and old wives' tales. This documentary, and the research behind it, is only possible because of one man's refusal to participate in that lie, Elias Thorne. By sending Dr. Finch's journal to a place of safekeeping, he created a crack in the wall of silence. For over a century, that journal sat in an archive, misfiled and forgotten, a ticking time bomb of forbidden history. Its recent rediscovery is what has allowed this horrifying story to finally be told. It reminds us that history is not always a settled, agreed-upon narrative. Sometimes, it is a crime scene, and you have to dig through layers of lies and silence to find the body. If you appreciate our dedication to unearthing these buried and banned histories, please support the channel by hitting the like button. It helps us continue to bring these forgotten stories into the light. Let us consider the science behind the horror. The story of the Blackwoods is a textbook, if extreme, example of the genetic consequences of inbreeding, a phenomenon known as inbreeding depression. When a gene pool is this small, recessive genes, which can carry harmful mutations, are far more likely to be expressed. Over generations, this leads to a host of health problems. In the case of the Blackwoods, we saw this manifest as skeletal deformities, such as spinal curvature, scoliosis, and limb abnormalities. The facial characteristics Elias observed, the wide-set eyes, the slack jaws, are also classic markers found in isolated, highly inbred populations. But the effects were not just physical. Dr. Finch noted Elspeth's descent into apathy and the vacant, listless demeanor of the entire family. Severe inbreeding can also have profound neurological consequences, leading to cognitive disabilities, learning disorders, and a range of psychiatric conditions. The loss of language is perhaps the most extreme manifestation of this. As their cognitive abilities declined and their isolation from the outside world became absolute, their need for complex language would have diminished. It would have slowly eroded, replaced by the primitive system of clicks and hums, a language sufficient for their simple, ritualized existence, but a language that marked their final, tragic separation from the rest of the human species. Jedediah Blackwood's perverse quest for purity had, in a cruel twist of irony, led to the systematic degradation of his own family's genetic code. He was the architect of his own lineage's extinction. The psychological aspect of the Blackwood case is just as disturbing as the genetic one. What is it like to be born into a world where everyone is family and everyone is unwell? A world with no outside contact, no frame of reference for what is normal. The Blackwoods lived in a closed psychological loop. Their reality was defined by the hollow, by their strange religion, and by the constant, visible presence of their own deformities. There would be no concept of beauty or ugliness, only the familiar faces of their kin. Their lack of emotional expression, which Elias found so unsettling, might have been a coping mechanism. In a life defined by physical pain and cognitive limitations, a state of placid, vacant apathy could be a form of self-preservation. Their rituals, the worship of the effigy god and the preservation of their dead, were all attempts to create meaning and order in a universe that had become chaotic and broken at a genetic level. The mausoleum was not just a tomb, it was their living history book, the only one they had. By surrounding themselves with their ancestors, they reinforced their identity, their belief in their own uniqueness, their own purity. It was a shared psychosis, a collective delusion that protected them from the horrifying truth of their own decay. They were a people who, in their profound isolation, had to invent their own culture, their own language, and their own gods, all in a desperate attempt to make sense of the curse that was flowing through their very blood. The setting of Hemlock Hollow is more than just a backdrop, it is a character in this story. The Ozark Mountains of the late 19th century were one of America's last frontiers, a rugged, unforgiving landscape that naturally bred isolation. Communities were small, scattered, and often suspicious of outsiders. This environment was the perfect crucible for a story like The Blackwoods. The steep hills and dense forests created natural barriers, making it easy for a family to cut themselves off from the world, and for the world to forget about them. The poverty of the post-Reconstruction South also played a role. Resources were scarce, and official oversight from the state government was minimal. A place like Hemlock Hollow could easily fall through the administrative cracks. No one was coming to check the census. No one was enforcing school attendance. The Blackwoods were able to create their own sovereign kingdom of decay simply because no one was watching. The flora of the region itself adds to the macabre atmosphere. The prevalence of hemlock, a poisonous plant, in the hollow's name is a potent symbol. The kudzu vine, an invasive species that suffocates everything it covers, is a metaphor for the encroaching genetic degradation that was strangling the Blackwood family tree. The hollow was both a sanctuary and a prison. It protected the Blackwoods from the outside world, but it also trapped them in their cycle of decline, concentrating their genetic curse until it became an all-consuming horror. The land itself was an accomplice in their slow, agonizing self-destruction. One of the most haunting artifacts of this case is the doll Elias Thorne found in the creek. Let's re-examine its significance. On the surface, it was a child's plaything, but as Elias later discovered, it was a grave marker from the infant cemetery. But it's more than that. The doll, with its twisted proportions, its extra limbs, its 3 mismatched eyes, is a piece of folk art that reflects the horrifying reality of the Blackwood family's existence. The children who made these dolls were creating effigies of what they saw around them, and perhaps of what they saw in themselves. The deformities were so common, so normalized, that they were incorporated into their art and their play. The doll is a window into the psyche of a Blackwood child, a child growing up in a world where the human form was not a fixed, reliable thing, but something mutable, prone to error and grotesque variation. There is a profound and heartbreaking innocence to the doll. It is not an object of horror to its creator. It is a representation of their reality. It is a toy, a memorial, a self-portrait. Of all the evidence in the Blackwood case, the journal, the ruins, the sealed tomb, the doll is perhaps the most personal and the most tragic. It is the silent, stitched-together testimony of a child who lived and died inside a nightmare. A child whose only legacy is this small, misshapen effigy that floated downstream and into the hands of a man from a world they could never know. It is the ultimate symbol of a story that is, at its core, about the profound suffering of children doomed by the sins of their fathers. The story of the Blackwood family does not exist in a vacuum. While an extreme example, it echoes other documented cases of isolated, highly inbred communities throughout history. From the secluded mountain valleys of the Appalachians to the remote islands of the Pacific, isolation has often led to similar, if less dramatic, consequences. The Blue people of Kentucky, for instance, a family with a rare blood condition called methemoglobinemia that turned their skin blue, were the result of a small, isolated gene pool. There are also the historical examples of European royal families who, through generations of politically motivated inbreeding, suffered from a host of genetic maladies like the infamous Habsburg jaw. What makes the Blackwood case so uniquely horrifying is the combination of factors. It wasn't just isolation. It was isolation combined with a fanatical, cult-like ideology that actively promoted incest as a virtue. Jedediah Blackwood didn't just stumble into a genetic dead end. He pursued it with religious fervor. This ideological component is what turned a predictable biological outcome into a macabre social experiment. The Blackwoods were not just genetically isolated. They were spiritually and psychologically isolated, locked in a feedback loop of madness and decay of their own creation. Their story serves as a dark cautionary tale, a horrifying illustration of what can happen when a small group of people becomes completely untethered from the rest of humanity, from shared social norms, and from scientific reality itself. They created their own world, and in doing so, they engineered their own private hell. Let us return to the final moments of the story. Elias Thorne, forever changed by his experience, Sheriff Brody, the weary guardian of a terrible secret, and the town of Providence, a community bound by a conspiracy of silence. The erasure of the Blackwoods was a multi-layered event. It began with Jedediah Blackwood himself, who erased his family from the outside world. Then it was continued by the unknown posse, who erased the family's home and their history with fire and stone. Finally, it was codified by Sheriff Brody, who erased the event from the official record. Why this desperate need to forget? It goes beyond simple shame or fear of scandal. To acknowledge the Blackwoods would be to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth about the human condition. That civilization is a thin veneer. That progress is not inevitable. That humanity, if left to its own devices in the dark, can unmake itself, can devolve, can slide back into something primitive and broken. The Blackwoods were a living, breathing refutation of the 19th century's belief in manifest destiny and endless progress. They were a biological ghost, a remnant of a darker, more chaotic past that the modern world was desperately trying to leave behind. To look at the Blackwoods was to look into a dark mirror and see a horrifying reflection of what humanity could become. It was easier to smash the mirror, to burn the evidence, to seal the tomb, and to pretend the reflection was just a bad dream. The cover-up wasn't just about protecting a town's reputation. It was about protecting a worldview. What became of Elias Thorne? He returned to Boston, but the man who left was not the same one who came back. His colleagues noted a change in him. He became withdrawn, prone to long silences, his work as a cartographer losing its appeal. The clean certainty of lines on a map seemed like a child's game compared to the terrible, uncharted complexities he had witnessed in Hemlock Hollow. He never married. He never had children. It was as if he feared passing on some unseen taint, some psychological scar from his encounter with the Blackwood curse. He dedicated the rest of his quiet, solitary life to the Historical Society, becoming an archivist, a keeper of stories. Perhaps he felt a sense of duty to preserve the truths that others were so eager to bury. He never spoke of the Blackwoods again, not in any documented letter or conversation. He kept his pact of silence with Sheriff Brody. But the act of sending the journal, of preserving the primary evidence, was his one act of defiance. It was his hope that someday, a future generation would be strong enough to hear the story. He died in 1934. An old man whose obituary mentioned only his quiet dedication to his work. There was no mention of the terrifying secret he carried for nearly 40 years, the secret of the family erased from time, the secret of what truly lay hidden in the dark heart of the American wilderness. Today, Hemlock Hollow is no longer on any map. The area is now part of a vast protected national forest. It is a place of serene natural beauty. The trees have grown back, covering the scars of the fire. The creek where Elias found the doll still flows. The limestone bluff where the cave was sealed is now covered in moss and ivy, indistinguishable from any other rock formation. There is no marker, No plaque, no sign that this was once the stage for a multi-generational human tragedy. The land has reclaimed the story, but if you walk those woods, some say you can still feel it. A cold spot in the air, an unnatural silence, the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. The Blackwood family is gone, but their legacy lingers as a palpable presence in the land, a psychic stain that can never be fully washed away. The story survived, passed down not in history books, but in the hushed, fearful whispers of the local people. A ghost story told around a campfire, its horrifying origins forgotten, but its power to chill the blood remaining undiminished. It is a testament to the fact that you can burn records, you can seal tombs, and you can enforce silence, but you can never truly erase a story. The truth, no matter how disturbing, has a way of clawing its way back into the light. The Blackwood curse was not just in their blood. It is in the soil, in the trees, and in the memory of the land itself. The rediscovery of Dr. Alastair Finch's journal in a Boston archive has finally allowed this band history to be reconstructed. It stands as the single, undeniable piece of physical evidence, the linchpin that holds this entire horrifying narrative together. Without it, the story of the Blackwood family would remain what the residents of Providence always wanted it to be. A myth, a legend, a dark fairy tale. But the journal is real. Its faded ink and water-stained pages are a direct link to that cursed hollow. It is the voice of a witness, a man of science who stared into the abyss and recorded what he saw. This case serves as a chilling reminder of the dark secrets that may still lie buried in forgotten archives, in sealed family Bibles, and in the collective, unspoken memories of isolated communities. How many other stories like the Blackwoods are out there, waiting? How many other families, other events have been deliberately and systematically erased from our official history because the truth was simply too macabre, too shameful, or too challenging to our sense of order? The Blackwood case suggests that the history we know is not the complete story. It is a curated version, edited for comfort and convenience. The real, unvarnished history of the world is a far more terrifying and disturbing book, and we have only just begun to turn its forbidden pages.